Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to this session entitled Grammar is Fun, Yes, Really. Some of you may be a little bit apprehensive about grammar and may be worrying about having to teach grammar in school. That's quite natural because the curriculum is something that was thrown at teachers a couple of years ago, and it's quite natural to feel a little bit apprehensive about that. So, who am I? Let me first introduce myself. So my name is Baz Arts and I'm a professor of English linguistics in the English department at UCL. I teach undergraduate and graduate students English language and English grammar, and I also teach on a number of CPD courses in English grammar, a longer version, if you like, of the session I'm going to present to you now. The session I'm going to present to you is a kind of condensed version of the CPD courses that we do throughout the year. I also advise the Department for Education on the grammar, punctuation and spelling tests, or SPAG tests as most people call them. So I'm involved in so-called test review groups where we look at the tests to see whether the questions are reasonable, doable for kids, or whether they are ridiculous. Sometimes questions come through that are quite ridiculous and shouldn't happen, so we look at those tests in great detail, so I know them quite intimately. And my research is in English grammar. So, what are we going to do? I'm going to start answering the question, why should we teach grammar at all? Why is grammar in the curriculum when previously it was part of the curriculum as well, but not tested? As you know, it's tested now. I'll give you a short overview of the grammatical content of the 2014 National Curriculum, which is available on the DFE website, but also on the website that I'm going to introduce to you called Englicious. A thread throughout the session is going to be grammatical form and grammatical function. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we're going to look at that in great detail. Those are two really important notions, and once you get your head around them, everything will kind of slot into place. And then finally, we're going to look a little bit about how we can teach grammar in context, so using real texts in the teaching of grammar. Okay, so first of all, what is grammar? Right? Grammar is the study of the structure of sentences. So you will know that a sentence is not just a random collection of words. There is a structure to them. Words combine into what we call phrases, and phrases combine into what we call clauses. So that's what grammar is about. Now, in a way, each and every one of you is already an expert in grammar. You understand what I'm saying. I'm using the English language. You're either a native speaker of English or a second language learner of English, but we all have some knowledge of grammar, of our native languages and of English and of maybe a few other languages. You know that if I say, you can understand every sentence I say, but if I say the tube horrible was this morning, or something like that, that's not a sentence of English. How do you know? Well, because you've learnt grammar. There are different ideas about how you learn grammar. One view is that we're all born with a kind of innate capacity to learn grammar. You may have heard of the American linguist Noam Chomsky, who's claimed that. Others, like Piaget, have claimed that you learn language in the same way that you learn other things in life. The jury's out on that one, but come the age of 1.5 to 2, some kids are a bit earlier, some are a bit later, you learn to master your native language wherever you're born, right? And that's quite an amazing feat if you think about it, because there's a lot to know. Apart from the structure of the language, we also know how to use the language in the right setting. You know that when you talk to your friends, you speak in a very different way than when you're talking to, say, a teacher or to some other person that is in a position of authority, right? We instinctively know how to use our language. Now, we use grammar to create meaning, and your students can learn how to do so effectively, to communicate effectively, speaking and also, of course, in writing, using real texts, such as poems and songs and stories appropriate to the age that you're teaching. That's really important, obviously, that you get the materials that you use right in terms of age. So why teach grammar? You might think, okay, that's all very well and very good, but why do we need to teach it? There's been some debate in the media about this. Some very famous children's authors have been saying, well, I got to be a famous author and I never studied any grammar. Why should small children be learning grammar? And it's a valid question to ask if you think about it. To my mind, the answer is that we study grammar and language for the same reason that we study other topics that are part of the curriculum. So why do we study history? Do children need to know who Henry VIII was? Do they need to know about the fire of London, which is often taught? Well, the real answer is no, they don't. But if they do learn about these things, it enriches their lives and it's part of their cultural identity. And we think language is too, perhaps even more so than history, because we use language every day. Imagine going through an entire day without being able to use language. So not being able to read anything, not being able to write anything, or even say anything or listen to anything. That's quite difficult to imagine, isn't it? So language is so much part of who we are that knowing something about language is a really valuable thing. So it's useful for kids to develop an understanding of how language works, knowledge of language, to discover something about themselves. For example, they might speak a particular dialect and realize that not everyone speaks that dialect. That's a valuable thing to learn. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's useful for them to know some of the meta-language for describing how language works. I'll come back to meta-language as well. It's the language we use to talk about language. We like to teach grammar to increase children's critical reading skills. The best way to increase your reading skills, of course, is to read a lot. But learning a little bit about how language works too helps your critical reading skills. It improves children's writing. The jury's a little bit out on that one as well. Some people say that traditional grammar teaching is not very useful for children to learn grammar, to learn a good writing. But that depends a little bit about how you define traditional grammar teaching. If you do teach grammar in a very traditional way, then it's likely that kids will switch off in the classroom. So when I was learning French in secondary school, the way that was done was through so-called drills. None of you will have been subjected to that, but these drills were literally patterns that you had to learn by heart. So in particular French tense or something, you'd get 10 sentences which had that tense in it and you had to learn them by heart. And then in the next lesson, the teacher would perhaps ask you to recite those sentences by heart. And that's not something that's very interesting, is it? If you're a 12-year-old, you don't really want to learn a language in that boring way, uninspiring way. So those people who say that teaching grammar in a traditional way, they are probably right, that's not the way to enthuse kids. Talking about enthusing kids, developing pupils' enjoyment of using language is a really, really important goal in teaching them grammar and knowledge of language. Kids naturally enjoy language. They love jokes, they love stories and poems and songs, as you know. So developing that is a really valuable thing. So there are broadly two attitudes to grammar. One attitude is what's called prescriptivism. So prescriptivism is the idea that grammar is viewed as a set of rules to be followed. Do's and don'ts, essentially. Don't split your infinitives. Don't end your sentences with a preposition. Don't start your sentences with and. Those are prescriptive rules. Linguists have moved away from this idea that we should tell students what to do and what not to do. The best view to take is that grammar is described as a living resource, as a set of options and choices. So knowing about grammar and knowing about language gives you choices, for example, in your writing. You can write sentences in many different ways, and the different ways that you can write sentences are offered to you by grammatical choices and grammatical patterns. So we take the view that We describe the language as it is. And so we also celebrate differences, right? So kids who speak a particular dialect or sometimes an additional language, for example, Welsh or Gaelic, those students will be effectively bilingual. And many of the kids in our schools are coming from other cultures. They might speak Portuguese, Spanish, Polish, Bulgarian, or whatever. And we need to celebrate that. We need to celebrate the differences. Though it's also important, of course, as the curriculum stresses, that children learn to use and to master the standard language, so the language that's used out there in newspapers, in the media, and so forth. Children need to know that, for example, a double negative, I didn't see nothing, is not part of the standard language. It might be part of their use of language, their variety of English, but it's not part of the standard language, and they need to know how to distinguish the two. There's some evidence, actually, that kids know how to do that quite well. So one teacher once told me that one of his students wrote lots of text messages in text speak, so heavily abbreviated, no full stops, no capital letters, nothing like that. And then he showed me an essay that this student had written at the same time. And that was in flawless English. So students are quite good at knowing what kind of language to use in what kind of situation. And we all kind of know that anyway. You speak differently to a family member or to a really good friend, as I said a moment ago. Okay, so descriptivism, a set of options. Language is a resource to be used. So what makes for a good grammar pedagogy? We think there are two components. So on the one hand, a very solid subject knowledge is very valuable. So knowing your grammatical terminology, this is what I referred to earlier as the meta-language. What terminology is used to talk about certain grammatical features, for example. And two of the key components, grammatical form and grammatical function, I'm going to come back to as we go along. So to give an indication of that, grammatical form is about grammatical categories, like nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, and so on. And also about phrases and clauses. These are all terms that children need to know by the time they get to year 6. And grammatical function is about notions such as subject, object, and adverbial. And in case you don't know what they are, don't worry, I'm going to come back to that. Pedagogical principles, I mentioned one of them already, using age-appropriate, authentic examples. So in old-style language teaching and grammar teaching, very often the examples were stale, old-fashioned examples. Again, when I learned French, I remember very well from my textbook, there was a picture of a family setting. In the foreground was a father smoking a pipe, reading a newspaper, and the sentence was, Papa fume une pipe, father smokes a pipe. And in the background you could see mother. Where do you think mother was? In the kitchen cooking, right? So mother is preparing the dinner. So that kind of stale, boring, artificial language is not what we want to use in our pedagogy. So the other thing we want to do is to link grammatical features and discussion to meaning and to authentic texts, as I said a moment ago. That's really important. You want the texts to relate to their world, their language. So, as you probably all know, in 2014 the new national curriculum came in. It was something that the government imposed on us. Teaching specification for grammar, punctuation and spelling GPS for key stages 1 and 2 were released, and there were associated tests. They took place at key stage 1 and key stage 2 initially. The key stage 1 test is now optional for schools. That happened after a test was leaked on the web just a day before the test was due to take place, and the government then decided to make that an optional test. So it's still being produced, but schools can decide whether or not they want to administer that test. The KS1 test is quite short. The KS2 test is about 50 assignments. and they take place in May. Now, all this material, so the specifications for Key Stages 1 and 2 and information about the tests you can find on the Englicious website, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. Now, when the curriculum came out, the government offered no support for teachers. So there were no CPD courses, there wasn't much textbook material or anything. One thing they did do was release the glossary, a glossary of grammatical terms. So you can find that on the DFE website, but also on our Englicious website. The definitions in that glossary are quite short and quite brief, and not all the terms are statutory, so you don't have to teach all of them, but only a subset of them. It is helpful, the glossary, but it is rather limited in many ways. So on our website, we've enlarged the glossary with additional terms, and we've also included some terms that are now not used much anymore in the curriculum. So there is quite a lot of emphasis on grammar. Children need to know a fair amount of grammar, but it's kind of finite. There are about something like 35, 36 terms they need to know, and that therefore you need to know when you teach them. It's manageable, right? If you haven't done any grammar before, you may feel a little bit overwhelmed at first, but you don't have to be. Now, the emphasis on grammar goes through into Key Stages 3 and 4 in secondary school, and we now see an interesting phenomenon that kids going into Year 7 very often know quite a bit more grammar than the teachers in secondary school, who are used to a different kind of model of grammar often, and they're quite surprised to find that these kids coming from Year 6 know a lot of grammar already. And for them it's great, because when they teach literature, for example, in Year 7, 8 and so forth, they know that the kids have that meta language already to help them talk about literature. So, as I said, many teachers, many of you may feel anxious about having to teach grammar. You may feel a little bit overwhelmed about it. You may think, well, I haven't done that before. How am I going to manage that? But you really don't need to feel that way, partly because I'm here to help you, and our website that I'll show you later on is there to support you as well. It is manageable, though there is a fair amount of it. So what I'm going to do today is go over the basics of English grammar. We've got a limited amount of time, so I can't cover everything in detail in the way that we do in our CPD courses. But I'll cover the basics of it, and you can ask some questions at any time. So, I've mentioned a couple of times already the notions of grammatical form and grammatical function. What is meant by that? Well, by grammatical form, we mean the building blocks of language, the bits and pieces. So the elements of sentences identified by their shape and typically by the company they keep. So this refers to notions such as noun, noun phrase, verb, adjective, adverb, and so forth, right? The building blocks. Function, grammatical function, is about the role that these elements play in sentences. We'll see that a subject of a sentence is typically a doer, some person usually that does something in a sentence. But we're going to come back to that later on. So in a table form, these are essentially the terms that kids need to know by the time they get to the end of Key Stage 2, Year 6. So the word classes include noun, pronoun, and verb in their present and past tense forms. They need to know about perfect and progressive forms. That's terminology that you may not be familiar with. Perfect refers to something like, I've seen the film before, and progressive is about, I am talking, I am swimming, I am walking, something like that. They need to know what an adjective is, an adverb, determiner, a preposition, and the two types of conjunction that we have in English, the subordinating conjunction that comes at the beginning of a subordinate clause, and a coordinating conjunction. I'm going to come back to some of those terms in a moment. And then each of these word classes also form phrases. So if you have a noun, as in, for example, cats chase dogs, then there are just two nouns there, but sometimes these nouns become larger. So you can say, cute cats chase nasty dogs or something like that, right? So cute cats and nasty dogs, not just nouns on their own, but they've formed a phrase, and we call that a noun phrase. I'll come back to that in a moment. They also need to know about preposition phrases. The other two terms here, adverb phrase and adjective phrase, they don't need to know about. They need to know what an adjective is, and they need to know what an adverb is, but not an adjective phrase or adverb phrase. So those terms with the asterisk, as you can see here, students are not required to learn these terms. But you'll find in the national curriculum documentation that reference is made to them nonetheless, which can be a little bit confusing. Then we have clauses, and the terminology they learn about are main clauses, subordinate clauses, relative clauses. A relative clause is something like the man who I saw on the tube this morning, blah, 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 something that starts with who or with that or something like that. They need to know about statements, exclamations, commands. That's caused a little bit of confusion in the recent past, what the difference between those three terms is. And they need to know about active and passive. What are active and passive sentences? Does anyone know? So if I have the sentence, the dog chased the cat. What's the passive? That's an active sentence. What's the passive version of that?
The cat was chased by the dog.
Yeah, so you do know. Look, so the dog chased the cat is active, and the cat was chased by, no, what was it? The dog chased the cat, and the cat was chased by the dog, right? One is active, and the other is passive. So they need to know this. Functions, grammatical functions, subject, object, and adverbial are the three terms they need to know. They don't need to know about complements and modifiers, but again, those terms are used a lot in the glossary, so it's useful for you to know about them. So any term that has an asterisk here is useful for you to know, but you don't necessarily need to teach it. So the teaching specifications are quite clear about what you should and what you shouldn't be teaching, so you can look that up. And like I said, they are on our Englicious website. So, remember, form includes word classes. So let's have a closer look at word classes. So a word class is a category or a type of word. At Key Stage 1, the curriculum prefers to talk about type of word. And in the Key Stage 1 test, the question might be something like, what type of word is quickly in the sentence below, right? Whereas at Key Stage 2, the term word class is used. So a word class is a category or type of word, for example, a noun, adjective, verb, preposition. The company that a word keeps helps you decide which word class it belongs to. So if I take a word like book, which word class is that? It's a noun, right? But actually, it has more than one answer to that question, because it can also belong to another word class. Which is that word class? Sorry? Verb, yes. So if you book a flight or book a train ticket or something, then the word book becomes a verb, right? So depending on the company it keeps, if I say, I booked a flight, then it's a verb, right? But I love that book you bought me, then it refers to an object and it's a noun. So that's what I mean by the company that a word keeps helps you decide which word class it belongs to. So there are quite a few words like that, that in isolation you can't tell which word class they belong to, right? But in a particular sentence you can. And that's important to remember. Many word classes have subclasses. So for the nouns you can have concrete nouns, so for example, table, screen, floor, chair, projector, all those words are referred to real three-dimensional objects, but we can also talk about abstract things in the world around us, right? You don't have to have, a noun isn't always referring to something that's touchable, as it were. And we can have pronouns like personal pronouns, he, she, it, they, we, us, them, but also relative pronouns, words like who, as in the man who came to see me, blah, blah, right? As I've just illustrated, many words belong to more than one category. So if you take a word like round, round can be an adjective, right? A round table. What else could it be? Verb, as in?
Go round the bend.
Round the bend, that's an interesting one. I would say that might be a preposition because that's got a noun after it, round, or noun phrase, round the bend. Right, but it can be a preposition. What else? Can it be a noun, round? What sort of sentence would it be a noun?
In the round.
In the round, yeah. Or now it's your round.
Yeah.
Round of drinks or something like that. Slightly less usual, you might say he rounded the corner. It's also possible, right? So you really need to look at where a word occurs in a sentence to know which word class it belongs to. So you'll get sentences like this in the Key Stage 2 test. Which sentence uses the word round as an adjective? So this is actually quite a difficult assignment for children, right? Which one is the correct answer?
The castle had a round tower.
This one, yes. How do we know?
Because it's qualifying the tower.
Yes. So adjectives are often described as describing words, right? They go with a noun like tower. And in this case, this word round tells you the tower was round, okay? Now in these other examples, ran round in circles. Let's look at this one first. There was a round of applause. What's round there? A noun, right? How do we know? Well, it's got, both have got the word before it, but it's got of applause after it. A round of applause would be a noun. This first one's actually quite hard. What do you think that is? The dog ran round in circles.
A verb.
Not a verb, because we've got a verb already in ran.
Preposition.
Preposition, possibly, or adverb, yeah. An adverb is a word that tells you how something was done, right? Or when it was done, that kind of thing, right? But it's not an easy assignment. Now, we have on our Englicious website lots of practice material for kids to get to know the parts of speech, the word classes. Part of speech is the same as word class. Some people have said, oh, why do we need kids to do these boring tests? Sometimes people call this the naming of the parts, and the tests are arguably not that exciting, and they do tend to be a little bit like identify this or identify that. And it could be improved a bit, it must be said. Anyway, this is the kind of thing that they need to be able to do. So let's look a little bit more closely at one of the word classes, perhaps one of the most important word classes along with verbs, namely nouns. How would you describe a noun if you were teaching about nouns? What would you say to your class? A noun is, yeah?
A person, place, and thing.
Person, place, or thing, right? That's the sort of standard definition. That's true. Lots of person, places, and things are indeed nouns, but we can also have more abstract nouns, right? So we can have things like happiness, or mystery, or politics, or knowledge, quite abstract, and some of them are not really Key Stage 1 or 2 words. So the definition of person, place, or thing works quite well a lot of the time, but it's important to be aware that they can be abstract as well. So if we want to keep away from that meaning definition of nouns, we ought perhaps to look at the shape of nouns and the company they keep, right? Remember, that's what we said about noun phrases, that you can identify them by their shape or the company they keep. So one thing to say about nouns is that they can be singular or plural. So cat, cats, dog, dogs, child, children. Verbs can't be singular or plural. Adjectives can't be singular or plural. They can in some languages, but not in English. So if we can make it plural, we know that it's a noun. They can be possessive. So you can say Evelyn's cat, or the rabbit's lair, or something, or the rabbits with the apostrophe at the end of a plural, right? This is called an inflection in English, where the word changes. And that too, again, is something that you can do with nouns. Or more precisely, actually, with noun phrases, but for now, this will do. They can follow a word like the, or un, or her, or that, or some. And these words are called determiners. And that might be quite a new word class to you. You may have heard of words like the and described as the definite and indefinite article from your grammar teaching, right? But this terminology determiner has come into the curriculum because it's part of modern linguistics. And one of the ideas behind the national curriculum was to update the grammatical terminology. So we now call words like the, her, that, and some, we call them determiners. And these are usually really small words that help you identify someone or something that you're talking about. So if I take the word the and so if I came into this room and said, I met a man on the tube an hour ago and he was talking to me about his family, blah, blah, blah. That would be a natural thing to do. I met a man on the tube, blah, blah, blah. If I started talking about the man, if I said, I met the man on the tube and he started talking about his family, if I said that I met the man, you'd be a little bit puzzled. You'd think, which man? He hasn't talked about any man before. So we use the when we have already kind of, you and I know who this person or individual is, and when they are not yet identified, right? So that's the difference. A word like her indicates typically possession, right? My book, her book. What about that? What does that do? So if I say, if I stand here with my hands on my back and I say, that toy is really nice, what would you say to me? So my hands on my back. That toy is really nice. What toy, right? So the word that requires me to point. That toy, right? Or this toy, those books, or these books. So that is far away and this is nearby. Those is far away and these are here, right? So these words too are called determiners in English. And kids need to be able to identify those as well. Now in the tests, usually they don't go for the more difficult words, like some, as in some peas, is also a determiner. But as you can see, we talked earlier about adjectives as describing words. Words like the and they don't describe the noun they go with, right? So if I say red apple, that tells you the color of the apple. But an apple, that doesn't tell you anything about what the apple looked like, right? So that's the difference between determiners and adjectives. And we can say about nouns, remember we're still talking about nouns, and we're talking about the linguistic features of them. You can have an adjective in front of them, so the fluffy rabbit. They can be followed by what's called a preposition phrase or a relative clause. So a preposition phrase is something like in the garden. So the rabbit in the garden is called a preposition phrase because it has the word in front of it. So in is a preposition. Prepositions are words like in, at, by, through, with, to, that kind of thing, yeah? So in the garden is a preposition phrase. Which hops slowly there is a relative clause. The rabbit which hops slowly. And that they need to know about too. So the which hops slowly and in the garden tell you a bit more about the rabbit. This tells you where the rabbit was in the garden, and that one tells you about something it does or did, right? Hopping slowly. And finally, we can say about nouns that they can be replaced by a word like they in this case. Cats purr, they purr, right? So, when you teach nouns, you can start saying they refer to real objects, people, places, or things, but you then have to be a little bit more precise about them. Now, I realize that at Key Stage 1, this stuff might be a bit hard, so this is mostly for you as teachers to be aware of what nouns are, that you can say to them, you know, a noun you can put in the plural. You can have cat and cats, table, tables, and so forth, right? So most of this is for you to acquire the subject knowledge about nouns, but some of this you can also teach your students. A phrase is a group of words, as we saw a little bit earlier, that goes together. So if we have something like the happy bunny, we have 3 words. And why did we call that a noun phrase? So the way to answer that question is to see which words you can leave out. Can you leave out the word bunny in that sentence? In that phrase, sorry. You can't leave out bunny because you get the happy. So bunny is that most important word there, and that's what makes it a noun phrase. Okay? So a group of words that belong together, the most important word of which is a noun, is called a noun phrase. Now here we have in the garden. The most important word here is in, followed by the garden. And in is a preposition, so we call that a preposition phrase, right? So that's the idea of phrases, words that belong together. And as I've already indicated, the most important word, we call it the head of the phrase. In the case of the happy bunny is bunny, and in the case of in the garden is in, okay? So the word class tells us what kind of phrase it is. Yeah? So, some more examples here. So the bunny is very happy in the garden. The bunny, as we saw, is a noun phrase. Bunny is the most important word. You can't leave bunny out because you just get the then. Very happy is an adjective phrase. Now, like I said earlier, you don't need to teach adjective phrases, but we know that happy is an adjective, right? And so if you stick something in front of that, very happy, it becomes a larger phrase, an adjective phrase. And again, you can't leave out happy, you get very. So if I said, the rabbit is very, it doesn't make sense. The rabbit is very happy, it's fine. In the garden, we saw as a preposition phrase, and the garden is again a noun phrase. 2 words, the and garden. Garden is the most important of the 2, because I can't say the bunny is very happy in garden, sorry, or in the, it needs garden, so that's a noun phrase, okay? Longer noun phrases in the curriculum are called expanded noun phrases. So typically where they have 2 to 3 words, right? So the garden, the beautiful garden, the happy bunny, those are expanded noun phrases. And for children to learn how to use expanded noun phrases will be helpful in their writing. Now what you'll find when you teach these expanded noun phrases is they quickly get the idea and they start using them over and over and over again. So there will come a phase where you kind of have to tell them, okay, you've got the idea of the expanded noun phrase. Now you don't have to use them everywhere because that's typically what they do. They will overuse them. But they will get that idea quite easily. Okay, so what I've talked about up to now, nouns, adjective, preposition, verbs, all those are word classes and belong to grammatical form, right? Grammatical categories. So now we're going to talk about grammatical functions. So that's what these building blocks in the sentence do, what their role is, right? What do I mean by that? So for example, take the notion of a subject. A subject in a sentence is typically defined as what the clause is about, what a sentence is about. And in the curriculum you find these terms, a doer or beer, right? So if I say the cat chased the rat, the cat is doing the chasing, and that's the subject of the sentence, okay? By beer, if I say something like, I am a teacher, then I am the beer. They're not great terms, but that's what's in the curriculum. And I think, you know, you can follow what that means, right? The doer or the beer in the sentence. And it's usually a noun or a pronoun or a noun phrase. So the nurse is helping the patient. The nurse here is the doer, right? Because he is helping the patient. Now you will have noticed that the nurse is also a noun phrase. You might say, well, just now you told us that's a noun phrase. We have 2 words here, a noun and the in front of it. So how can it be a subject and how can it be a noun phrase at the same time? And the answer is that it's a noun phrase at the level of grammatical form, but the grammatical function is a subject, right? So we have these 2 levels of analysis that you need to keep apart. And once you get that, a lot slots into place. A lot of the help materials that you find online, if you were to type subject into Google, you'll get lots and lots of websites, you get lots and lots of videos that will tell you what a subject is, but they're not all correct. There are lots of people out there who do language videos and they don't really have any credentials, any expertise to teach grammar, or they might be teaching a kind of grammar that is not the grammar that's adopted in the curriculum. So I would discourage you from using Google in the same way that if you're feeling a little bit ill, it's not such a good idea to use Google to self-diagnose. If you have a little pain in your stomach, all kinds of stuff comes up and makes you feel very anxious because you think, oh yeah, that's what I've got, must see the doctor tomorrow. With grammar, it's a little bit the same. You get all these answers, they're not all reliable. So stick to the reliable information. So, subject is usually a doer or beer, usually a noun, pronoun, or noun phrase. Often occurs immediately before the verb. So here we have two verbs actually, is helping, and the subject occurs before it. Sometimes after it. So you can say, is the nurse helping the patient? As we get here, right? So that's when you form a question. You invert the first verb with the subject. They change places. It's usually repeated in what we call a tag question. So the nurse is helping the patient, isn't he? The he that we have here refers back to the nurse. So that's another way in which you can identify a subject. Now, most of this stuff here is for your benefit. Again, I'm not suggesting for a moment that you should teach this at Key Stage 2. For them, for the kids, usually doer or beer is quite sufficient. But for you to have a bit more solid linguistic subject knowledge by identifying subjects in this way can be quite helpful, okay? Is that notion of a subject clear, right? Yeah, so it's what the function is of this noun phrase in the sentence, right? So again, grammatical form, noun phrase, grammatical function, subject. Short recap then. So form, identifying elements by their shape or company they keep, and function, identifying elements of sentence by what they do. Subject, object, adverbial. So that's why we can say, here we have two sentences. The fluffy rabbit greedily ate the juicy grass, and the dog chased the fluffy rabbit. In both these cases, rabbit is a noun, and a fluffy rabbit, the fluffy rabbit, is a noun phrase. But their grammatical functions are different. In the first sentence, the fluffy rabbit is the doer, and in the second sentence, the dog chased the fluffy rabbit, we call that an object. So that's a second function label, object. The fluffy rabbit undergoes the chasing. That's usually how an object is defined, something that undergoes something, right? So if I say, I kicked the ball, I is the subject, and the ball is the object, undergoes the kicking, right? So that's why you can have a noun phrase having different grammatical functions in the sentence, right? So that's why a noun phrase can be two things at the same time. It can be a noun phrase and a subject, or a noun phrase and an object, right? Just bear that in mind. That's very important. Now we have produced here at UCL Knowledge Organiser. It looks like this. It's a foldable overview of English grammar, which you can use in the classroom. As you can see, it's got lots of pictures on it, which are appealing to kids. And it describes, say, the word classes in the way that I've done a moment ago. But I've only been able to do it in this short session for nouns, but it does it for all the word classes. So it's a useful tool to have with you. Let's have a further look at this idea of form and function by looking at some further sentences. And this sentence is actually on that knowledge organizer. So here we have a sentence which runs here in the middle. Our teacher wrote a poem on Monday, right? Up here we have form. So this top level is all grammatical form, and the bottom level here is grammatical function. So how can we analyze this sentence? And again, most of this is useful for you. Some of it can be done in the classroom, but not all of it, or maybe towards the end of year 6. So we have a noun phrase here, our teacher, right? Why is that a noun phrase? because the most important word is teacher. Okay? And teacher is also the subject. As you can see, it's two things at the same time. It's one thing at the level of grammatical form and another thing at the level of grammatical function. It's the subject in function and a noun phrase in form. And it has a word in front of it, and that we call a determiner. Okay? Then we have a verb, write. Now, verbs are usually defined as doing words, as you know, right? Writing is a doing activity. Some verbs also indicate non-activities, so you might say think, for example, or believe are verbs, but you're not necessarily doing something when you believe something, right? So a doing word is a useful definition, but you have to bear in mind that verbs can also indicate other things. So if I say I am a teacher, then I'm not actually doing anything. It's just the state that I'm in. That's my job, right? Now watch here. So here we have a noun phrase, a poem, same kind of structure as here, except we have a different determiner. But this time, this noun phrase is the object of the sentence. Who did the writing? The subject, our teacher. What did he write? A poem. And then right at the end is the third grammatical function, which I haven't mentioned yet, or only in passing. It's called adverbial. What's that about? Well, the adverbial in the sentence tells you how, when, or where something was done. It's usually optional information about what the sentence expresses. In this case, it tells us when the teacher wrote a poem, on Monday. The grammatical function is adverbial, but the grammatical form is a preposition phrase, on Monday. Right? So there again we see grammatical form and grammatical function. Let's do some more. One more sentence, or two more. I've got two more. He bought a dog last week. Subject is he, a pronoun. The verb is bought. What did he buy? A dog. That's the noun phrase. And it's an object. When did he buy it? Last week. In this case, the adverbial is a noun phrase. Not a preposition phrase, but a noun phrase. Yeah? One more. The train will arrive when the sun has set. Subject, the train. Now we've got two verbs, will arrive, and we've got what's called a subordinate clause. I'd love to talk to you more about subordinate clauses, but there isn't any time. But these are introduced by a subordinating conjunction like when. If you want to know more about this, on our website you can find more about this. And the function of that entire subordinate clause is adverbial. It tells you when the train will arrive. Okay? So, a little bit about teaching grammar in context. I know that on your course you get a lot more about that. We like to think that it's a good idea to integrate grammar into studying real texts. Understanding how grammar operates as a tool for constructing meaning. So not just labeling the parts, naming the parts, but embedding the grammar in real texts. So you can ask, how do particular words or phrases make you feel as a reader, and why is that? What would happen if you changed words in this poem or song or story? And what kind of grammar patterns do you notice? Those are just some suggestions. So you could take this really short poem by Edward Lear, the Yonghy Bonghy Bo, whose head was ever so much bigger than his body and whose hat was rather small. Really short poem. They will enjoy that. They will enjoy the picture that goes with it. And you can ask them, what is Yonghy Bonghy Bo? Strange thing, never come across. What would it be, do you think? If you were to give that a word class label, what would it be? A noun, yes. And how do you know? It's got a word the in front of it, right? So, Yonghy Bonghy Bo is in brown. It's got a word, it's got the in front of it. Head is another noun. His body, whose hat. These are all nouns. And then we have these two verbs here, was ever so much bigger and was rather small. And two adjectives, bigger and small. And adjectives can typically occur in three forms, big, bigger, biggest, right? So even in this really short little poem, you can get them to look at the grammar. Which nouns can you see? Which adjectives? What's that adjective doing here? Bigger than his body, right? There's some sort of comparison. Head was bigger than the body. Oh yeah, you can see that in the picture, okay? So it's just a very short example of how you can use a real text, age appropriate, to look at grammar in a particular context. This is the website that I mentioned to you, and this is the address, Englicious.org. We're in the process of redesigning it. We're not quite there yet, so when you log into it, it looks a little bit different than this. But the new resource will be out soon. What does it offer you? So it offers you an overview of all the programs of study and attainment. It's got lesson plans, starters, larger projects. It's got assessments and exercises, a complete overview of English grammar. So if you're wondering about a particular aspect of grammar that you have to teach, you'll find it there. It's got an enhanced glossary that I talked about. So again, you can go to the glossary, and if you've forgotten what an adjective is or what an adverb is, or a fronted adverbial, much discussed, then you can find it there. And it's got other professional development teachers, development materials for you as well. For pupils, it will help them learn about English grammar in an engaged way, in a fun way, using games and exercises and activities, and they can be projected onto an interactive whiteboard. It helps them develop their literacy skills with a focus on spelling, punctuation, and writing. And really importantly, as I stressed earlier on, it helps them develop their enjoyment of using language, both in spoken and written form. It helps them develop confidence in talking and in writing. Very important thing. Lots of kids don't feel all that confident. And it also, yes, we're in an age where test scores matters. It helps them improve test scores as well. So this one I want to show you live because I think it's a really nice one. So this is an activity that you can project on the interactive whiteboard. Now this isn't an interactive whiteboard, so I'll do it with the mouse. So this is the idea behind this is that there's a game here, and is create a sentence. So you get a child to come up to the board, and they will move around, ideally with their fingers, because you can just move them around on an interactive whiteboard. And they will love to do this. You can click these words together, and a child will come up with something like this. Okay? So you've got little Johnny in front of the classroom. And then very quickly, hands will go up. What will the hands want to say? So what this is about adverbs, right? A word like quickly tells you how she combed her hair. Quickly. Now, one thing about adverbs is that they are optional. You don't have to have them. She combed her hair is a complete sentence. But you can do something with that adverb. Yes? You can move it around. And they know this. And what you do is you unclick it, and then you move it there. But then another child will raise their hand and say, what? You're nodding. She quickly combed her hair. You can actually also put it here. So you open it all up. Oops. And you stick it in there. So remember what I told you about boring grammar teaching? An adverb is movable, an adverb this and that. By doing grammar, by getting them to actually play around with this sentence, they learn that this word, an adverb, can be moved around. So they get the idea of an adverb by playing with it online. Yeah? That's the whole idea of the Englicious website. This is another one that's quite good fun to do, the noun phrase generator. What's that about? So we've looked at noun phrases, and we've said that noun phrases are words that are phrases that have got a noun in them. So you can tell them that an expanded noun phrase might have a determiner, an adjective, and a preposition phrase in it. And this they can play with too. Again, I wish I could show it to you with my hands, but you can move those words around. So you can create something like many mouldy monkeys in the classroom, or many mouldy monkeys in the cupboard. And we've seen this in the classroom. They're really, really keen to come up and do this and create the daftest, funniest noun phrase. For us, they're a bit cheesy, but they love that kind of thing. And again, what's the idea behind it? They need to know what a noun phrase is. The tests require that. The curriculum requires that. But by playing around with these columns, they can actually create lots of different, the unusual spider with beady eyes, right? So the funnier the noun phrase, the better it is. But as they do this, again, they get the idea of what a noun phrase is. It's a set of words that has a noun in it, and then it's got something in front of it and something after it. So playfulness is a really important feature in this website, Englicious. Okay, so to round up, there's lots of support for you teaching grammar. As I said, be careful with Google. Not everything is very accurate. So use our Englicious website, because the grammar that you have on that website is national curriculum grammar. That's the grammar that they will be tested on. We have 2 courses that I already mentioned at the start, English Grammar for Teachers and Teaching English Grammar in Context. They're expanded versions of what I've talked to you about today, but in more detail, far more detail than I was able to do in this short session. About to come out is our book, How to Teach Grammar, mainly aimed at secondary school teachers, but also useful for you, because the first part of that book is all about subject knowledge. And again, it's tailored to the national curriculum. And I've mentioned the knowledge organisers already. We also have wall posters for in the classroom and so-called flashcards that kids can use, which describe the various parts of speech and the various phrases and clauses. So, thank you very much for listening, and we're on Twitter as well. You can follow us. Thank you.